Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. We're in Studio A here at Sweetwater, and we're with the master. Alan Sides is here.
Not a master, but glad to be here.
I would say so, man. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming back in. We've been showing off your amazing monitors to the sales engineers, and we were doing a little listening, and man, it just sounds fantastic, which kind of brings me to the topic of what I wanted to talk to you about,
Sure.
which is great gear.
Yes.
Because there's that huge range of gear that's out there, and I want to start out by saying that, we all know that you can get great results with affordable gear, and that is not the point of this at all.
Right.
Well, what I want to talk to you about is you're well known for the quality of your ears. You hear so much that maybe the rest of us don't even hear, but you've also used all the cool gear and owned and created the cool gear and worked in great rooms. So let's talk a little bit about that. What to you are the benefits of great gear? What does that bring to what you do?
Well, you have to be at least a certain level. I mean, in other words, you can get by with certain minimal things, but there's a certain point at which a voice just doesn't sound like a voice. There has to be a certain level of quality to reproduce it in a way that sounds reasonably natural.
Right.
And of course, if you're a really good engineer with a great sense of where things should be, you can take something that's a lesser item and you can finesse it to some degree, but it's certainly not as good as if you had a device or a microphone that sounded great to start with. Mm-hmm. Same thing is true with a high quality mic pre. Something that is just pure and natural, and it produces great transients. Those things make a difference in the end product. And I think, to be honest, pop music has suffered quite a bit. In what I'm hearing right now, there's a lot of stuff done in the houses and a lot of people using stuff that really isn't 100%. And you hear it in a lot of the recordings.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't mean you have to spend an absolute fortune, but there's some really great stuff that isn't necessarily outrageous, but it really delivers a minimum acceptable level of quality.
Right. The key is to focus on quality. That's what matters. We're not talking about price here. We're talking about quality.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, price does not necessarily relate specifically to quality.
Right.
You can't always,
Right.
There's a lot of things that are very expensive that don't sound good. In the same respect, there are a lot of things that are inexpensive that are actually quite good.
Right. I've always had kind of two approaches to it. And the first, I'll get your thoughts on this. My first is that I never wanted the gear to be an excuse or a reason for the outcome. Mm-hmm. So I never want to say, well, that would have been great if only I'd had this or if I'd used that. So I want to remove the gear from the equation.
Right. Well, I can't, because a lot of times I've had to work in environments where I didn't have all those great things.
Yeah.
And so as an engineer, I have to figure out ways to make that work. Because I'm a punch dynamic freak. I love impact and I like attack. I have to figure out how to move these mics and place them in such a way and how I mix and how I equalize it to get the most I possibly can out of lesser stuff. Mm-hmm. But when I have the opportunity to have something nice, it sure makes things easy.
Right. That's actually my second.
Right.
It just seems like it's easier to get good results.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing how often, I'll be working on a project and they'll have done vocals and it's, they use some horrible compressor and it's completely it's not set up well and the mic technique is not good and I have to go and just spend hours fixing it all, so that every word is clear and defined. Of course, obviously in the Pro Tools world, it's possible to fix all this stuff.
Right.
Where in the early years, it was much harder to, so we had to get it right. Because you're mixing live, you just don't have enough time to finesse every word. I mean, in the early years, we used to we might put a vocal on 4 channels with different EQs in each channel and just go back and forth to try to get a balance, because we didn't want to go down a full generation to comp it and re-cue every word. So we would do it on the console, but there's still limitations for that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there were workarounds.
Yes.
That you would do to make it work in the pre-automation, the pre-digital age and things. So let me ask you this. What do you think if someone's going to put together a rig, studio rig, and they're going to do some recording, what's the first key thing that they should focus on, we'll say, outside the room itself?
Well, I don't say this because I make speakers, but to me, if you're hearing right, everything's easy. Mm-hmm. If what you're hearing is not accurate, you're just fighting an uphill battle all the way. So that's a combination of A, having the right speaker, and B, having it work in your room. Mm-hmm. Figuring out how to get rid of the first order reflections, to get the most direct, natural sound so that when you walk out of your room, you feel comfortable that what you have is what you think you got.
Right.
Because I think we've all, as engineers, have had situations we thought we nailed it, and then we go and play in the car or elsewhere. Oh my God, how could I have missed that? And I'm kind of a perfectionist, so, although it's funny, I've worked on a lot of albums, but, I'll occasionally listen to something, and I'll be in an elevator, I'll hear some song, go, why didn't I raise the backgrounds in the chorus half a dB, It's an unlimited,
Right, right.
You can never always get everything perfect. But the other thing too, oftentimes I find is, as a mixer, oftentimes my first impression is often the right impression. And as I belabor it and go down the line, it gets more and more further away from what that was.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great story. My dear friend Bruce Sweeney and Quincy Jones were mixing a song with Michael Jackson. And they did a couple great mixes and they thought it was great, but then they ended up doing like another 86 mixes. And then Quincy comes in, he listens to it, and he says, we finally nailed it. I think that's good. He says, let me hear mix 2. They put up mix 2 and says, we're done. Michael, we all looked at us, so it just shows you we can all get past it,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So the monitoring, totally agree, 100%. If you can't hear accurately, nothing else is really going to matter.
Right, and then because you're judging the microphone, but more than that, you're judging how you're tailoring it, how you're EQing, and where you're setting the levels and the reverbs and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And that stuff's really important. Then the next thing, of course, is just to have a recording format that is something that's usable to you. I mean, that it's functional in a way that you can understand it and make it function. If you're, at home, it's not as easy. But, with Pro Tools, it changed a lot of things in all of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And but then the other thing I would say is if I had a simple system sitting at home, I would like at least 2 to 4 superb mic pre's.
Okay.
That really are good. Because a lot of times you're recording just 1 or 2 things at a time.
Mm-hmm.
You have 2 great mic pre's and then, a selection of microphones that are going to cover what you need for
Mm-hmm.
recording.
Right, and if you were going to kind of outline what that selection would be, what would you point to?
Well, the most important thing is probably a vocal mic.
Mm-hmm.
You got to pick up something that you think is going to cover a number of singers, because you can't have everything, because every mic isn't right for every singer, but you'd have to find something that's in the middle ground that you think is going to be reasonably good. It's worked for a singer. What I do is if you get 2 or 3 mics in, put your headphones and listen to them. And I used to go through all these old tube mics that I would buy in Europe, and I think I bought 1,500 tube mics from Europe over a period of time. At that time I had my ESP9 electrostatic headphones, and I would sit there and I would compare a dozen U47s, and I would listen to each one, pick the ones I liked the best, and then I would start switching capsules and tops and try different bodies with different things. Then I found that the chrome-plated ones sounded much better than nickel-plated ones, but it turned out it wasn't the capsule, it was actually the high-frequency diffusion between the matte finish and the silver finish made a difference at the 16 kilohertz range. You got better 16K.
Wow.
So then I picked the best capsules with the best,
Right.
And so that's how I developed the Ocean Way mic collection, which is headphones, me talking in the mics.
Wow.
Because I've been doing it for so long that I can hear my voice and I know exactly.
Right.
Well, a lot of times if I'm doing a session, I'll put the headphones on, I'll walk in, I'll listen to each microphone. And I'll have my second, okay, let me hear, I'll listen to each one, I'll pick the distance, I'll kind of set the levels, and I'll preset most of the mic levels that I think would be pretty close to what it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So when the musicians walk in, I'm usually, or I'll actually play the drums, and I'll have it come in, and I'll play it, and I'll listen to it, and I'll put the headphones on and make sure that it's right.
Right. Which the advantage to that then is the musicians can come in and you're 90% of the way there.
90% of the way, it makes things much easier. Because that's another thing that's really gone downhill is the musicians need to hear something good in their headphones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and a lot of people, they're not really making an effort. You need to make it sound great, because if you make it sound great for them, they're going to play great.
Right.
And their whole sense of dynamic relates to the balance they hear. And if you have great verbs or things you can use that create a space that allows them to play into that, they're going to play better.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's all.
So we've got monitoring.
Yes.
We've got preamps.
Right.
What would you say is next?
Well, equalizers.
Yeah?
Yeah, I really need. Now, in the regards, there's a lot of respectable plugins, but in the digital world, high frequency boost stuff above 10K in the digital domain is not anywhere near as pretty as analog EQ.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how else to say it, you know what I mean? It just doesn't have the resolution. Some are better than others, but like an original API 550A or a Lang or a Pultec, or there's lots of really nice EQs, that are an important part of me as a mixing and recording tool.
Mm-hmm.
Because also recording the digital domain, say you're recording an instrument that's a little on the dark side, and you put a couple mics on it, and you want to add highs later, but you can't do it right then. The problem is once you record it in the digital medium, say you're at 48 kilohertz, you'll lose a lot of resolution. So when you try to EQ it after the fact, it doesn't sound anything like it does if you EQ the mics directly. Because you're increasing the resolution. The bit rate's much higher because you're recording at your higher level. You're getting that 15K stuff is now at a much higher level than it would have been had you recorded with no EQ.
Right.
Now, the last thing you want to do is put bad EQ on it because you can't take that off.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like avoid bad EQ.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, I think that sometimes those of us who aren't full-time professional engineers will read interviews or see people talking, and they'll say, "Well, if you position the mic right, you don't need any EQ," and you're not afraid to use EQ.
Well, no, you know, let's say you can find the perfect microphone for the singer, and this singer really works the microphone well. Because a lot of time when I'm recording a vocal, the most important thing is that they're on axis, that they're right in the center, and they're at exactly the right distance. Well, it's hard to do that. So when I put my windscreen, I set the windscreen far enough away that they cannot get too close. Because the second they get too close, it goes underwater, and then you have to take out all this mud. When you're mixing it, certain words will go like this, and it'll be clear. And so I'll take the 300 and 400 out during those sections. I'll add high frequency shelving. I'll make those words clear. Mm-hmm. And then the other word's perfectly clear because they're in the right spot. So I put a little dot on the windscreen. I says, this is the on axis dead spot. And I know this is crazy, but if you can be here and you can be on that spot, every word will be clear. So, right. You know, you try to do everything you can to get them to be where they need to be.
Right, because they're typically going to want to get close in to get the proximity effect and the big low end and all that stuff, which isn't necessarily effective in a recording.
Well, some singers, like, you know, you go back to like Sinatra and Crosby, when they were starting with big bands, singing into a 44 and it's all live broadcast, if they didn't make every word perfectly clear, they could never pop the mic. They had to eliminate S's. They had to make it sound perfect because there was no one to fix it. Mm-hmm. So like when I recorded Sinatra, it amazed me that I remember I was on like a C12, he was like this, and he walked up to the microphone and we did the track, and I didn't even get a level with no compressor, and I was watching and I could have had an insert if I needed to have a 160 rate if I needed. No compressor, was perfect. Huh. Every word was perfect level-wise because he was just an amazing professional guy.
Wow.
But lots of great singers that are like that, like James Taylor. So many great singers who get a great sound. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember I was doing a thing on a Chris Buddy show in Boston, and Sting and Josh Groban were doing a duet. And Sting has really, really good mic technique. Every word sounds crystal clear. But Josh was a little off axis here and there. And so sometimes it'd be perfectly clear, and other times it would be underwater. So I would EQ that to, you know, I'd go in and I'd finesse it so every word sounded as clear as Sting. I mean, Josh's singing is insanely great, but they got to be, and in the words, you have to get the end result.
Right.
You know, it needs to deliver the goods. Yeah. You know, for what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of microphones, we're what, at number 4, right? Monitors, preamps, EQs. You haven't mentioned that microphones are they in the top 4? Are they in the top 5?
Oh yeah. I mean, microphones are. Well, speakers, I can hear it also, but yeah, microphones are even more important, I guess. Speakers and microphones might be the two things, but obviously the mic players need to be good. The mics don't work. Right. So it's a line, but. You know, and there are some good microphones out there, but the best thing to do is to listen, just for your purposes, is to get a number of them and A/B them and see what you actually like. Right. You know, there's nothing better than that.
Yeah, that's the ideal.
Right.
You know, for many of us, that means going to YouTube and listening and hearing what's on recordings and things. But it gives you an idea. It gives you a taste of what the microphone can do and what it's going to be good for.
Right.
So that's the whole thing, right? Is to narrow it down to what's going to work great for what you want to do.
Exactly right.
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 So we go past then. So we'll say monitors. We'll say preamps, microphones, and then we'll say EQ.
Yeah.
And then is dynamics in there somewhere?
Well, yeah. I mean. There are some good digital compressors. Most of the time now, like when I record vocalists, I may put a compressor on it for monitor purposes, but I'll actually, later on, I won't use the compressor. I'll go and manually ride every word myself. Oh. I mean, I'll spend an hour on the vocal. So I'll get the mix up as a finished mix. I'll put the vocal fader where I want it, and I'll make every ride so that it's a finished record with the vocal just sitting in one spot. You know, make it right. And I'll correct the EQ on every word, whatever I need to do to make it sound clear. You know?
Well, the results speak for themselves. I'm not going to argue with that.
It's great to have that.
Yeah.
I mean, years ago, I was doing this Both Sides Now with Joni Mitchell, and Joni's mic technique was, you know, she's a great singer, but she was really on and off again, and it would go, you know, very dark, and then it'd be clear. And so there, I was doing vocal comps, and I had a dozen vocals we'd done. And then when I did vocal comps, I would basically do all the level rides and EQ changes and then punch in the words one by one. And sometimes I would take like an API, and on one word, I'm gonna have to go -6 at a 200 hertz shelf and +4 at a 5K and 2 at 15 to make that same word sound like the next word, or even half of one word sound like the next word. So you're going live and then punching it in on the multitrack. So I was able to get a perfectly great sounding vocal pre-Pro Tools by doing this with 2 analog machines.
Wow. That had to be a sight to behold.
Yeah. And, and Joni's very picky. So we I'd spent some time, but we came out great. Really, sounded very natural. Doesn't sound like you did anything to it.
All right.
Because the premise also, it shouldn't sound like you did anything. It should sound like it lays there.
Right.
Because same thing, if you overcompress, some singers, they don't do well with compressors. And even though you may need some level of control, it seems to take a lot of the body out of the vocal. And other singers, God, you can use a lot of compression and it sounds fine. Mm-hmm. Because their vocal has enough attack and presence that it doesn't seem to degrade.
Right.
Where other singers don't have quite a moat that you take too much out of them, you can't get it back.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. So that's the importance of the capture stage, we'll call it.
Yes.
So the monitoring is overriding, but then there's the capture stage, the microphone, the preamp. Do you compress on the way in, or do you tend
Sometimes.
to do that?
It depends on the singer.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing that with Catherine McPhee, and she has, when she sings, she's like Linda Ronstadt. When she sings on the mic, it's like, wow, it's so loud. It's really crazy. So, I was using an original DBX 160 with her, and I probably had, 13 or 14 dB of compression at the peaks. But it sounds great with her because it's a fast compressor. It comes back fast enough. And it worked great. Without a compressor, it would have been very difficult.
Yeah.
With her, I also need something because her attacks are so fast. It's got a super fast compressor to take the front because it's nothing like 1176. It's a teeny bit slow on the front end, and if the singers, if they ramp up, it's no problem. If they go then you sometimes get like a peak that comes down. It's much harder to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it depends on the singer.
Sure.
Sometimes 11.6 works great. And of course, sometimes in LA2 is, you can't ask for more because it does something more than just compression. It adds a certain warmth and that's wonderful.
Right, as a thing. Which is something else with the quality gear, we'll say, if we're going to put it that way, is often it does have a signature.
Oh, yeah.
That may be right, may not be right, but it's something that you kind of work with.
Well, yeah, because there's different kind of like it's funny, like the old API 550A, the original one, clearly it does change the sound slightly, but the one thing it doesn't do is take away any punch. Mm-hmm. It's super fast and punchy. And so it adds just a little bit of edge to it, but nothing that's to complain about, really.
Right. So
using the equipment to your advantage, if it has a character that really gives you a nice thing. Yeah, one time we were doing an album with Aerosmith, and it was in Record One Studio A, and Mike Schilte was mixing, and the band had recorded the whole thing at home. It was the beginning of Pro Tools, early Pro Tools. And early Pro Tools was fairly awful sounding, but particularly awful if you recorded things at very low levels, because there was just no resolution. And so the band just recorded everything real low. So when you bring up all the backgrounds, they sounded kind of gritty and buzzy sounding. So Mike said, well, why don't we just transfer it to a Studer 800 and then back again? And when you put it to the analog machine and brought it back, it did give it it glued it together in a nice way. It made it sound infinitely more listenable. Right. So sometimes you can use these earlier things as artifacts that actually can give you a tremendous, a positive result.
Yeah, sure. Well, that, speaking of glue and bringing everything together, there's the front end that we've been talking about. There's also the back end.
Right.
So a lot of engineers, they'll mix into a compressor or a limiter or an EQ on the two bus, on the stereo bus. Is that something you like to do? Is there something you recommend for that part of the process?
I have to say that that's probably my biggest thing I hate the most.
So I stepped in it right there.
You sure did. No, because the thing is that when Bruce was mixing all those Michael Jackson, there's no compressors in the bus. In fact, all the 80s rock, there's no compressors. There may be compressors on individual instruments or there's that, but there's no compressors in the bus. And so I think part of the demise of alternative rock was bus compressors because it took all the punch and impact. So 80s rock is just fine, but then you get this later stuff and it's all just crunched and no punch. So R&B and rap stuff had nice big bottom and punch. And so the kids played it in their cars and it made the speakers move. And the alternative rock just sounded flat. It was loud, but it had no definition or punch.
Right.
So the thing is, if you were mixing, like I remember I would sit there with Bruce and he's mixing a song with Swedin, and he's listening to it. He's trying to create the most dynamics he possibly can. And if there's any hole, he'll actually go in and listen to every instrument and say, well, right here, Nathan East, he did this 2 great bass licks. And then Paul Jackson Jr.'s got these 3 or 4 spots where he's just on fire. And he'd find every moment that was a high. And he would make sure that you heard those clearly. The other thing he would do is, after he's listening on the big speakers to make sure it's big and punchy, he'd listen to the smaller speakers at a very modest level. Then he'd play it on a mono oritone at about 75 dB. And he says, if there's a hook and I can't hear it, it's not happening. And he wouldn't, and so he would make those changes. The overall mix really wouldn't change much in the stereo, but it'd be enough to know that if you were in some department store and you heard it coming from one speaker, you would hear the hooks, every line that mattered. Now, when you use a compressors like that, it fills the holes, it fills all the holes, but it also takes away a lot of space. So there's not as much room to hear everything as clearly. And so it's a fight, becomes more of a fight for space. But then everybody gets used to hearing this sort of roar of the compressor. Well, you could do the way I look at it is I can take a compressor like this ADR Complex is sitting right here, and I can create a mult of the mix bus and bring it back as a second pair. And I can add it back into my mix. That way all of my peak stuff is untouched, but I'm getting the roar of the compression underneath. So I get the whole thing. So sometimes I want that sound, but I don't want the peaks coming down.
Right.
And so it takes more time and effort to mix without a compressor, but the end result is way more fun.
Nice.
Yeah.
So basically what you're talking about then is like a parallel type of an approach where you go through both simultaneously and blending to taste.
Exactly. So I'm not compressing I'm just taking mults of whatever instruments I want to compress, or in case, and I have this as a separate thing I can add back in.
Right.
Sometimes I'll do it on the entire mix and have that as an effect return. Other times I may do it on just the overhead drums or this instrument that I want.
Right.
So I think that this is the problem is that especially if you have a song where it's dynamic and has a fairly quiet front and the first verses and the chorus is huge. If you compress the whole thing, the chorus sounds like it's underwater and the first verse and the things sound great. So you pay a price.
Right. I think part of the reason for that and why I think many of us do compress on, have a 2-bus chain that we go through is because we're used to hearing things so compressed with the delivery media that we have now. The way we're listening, everything is very compressed. And so if it doesn't sound like that, it almost doesn't sound right.
Well, because you can make it sound like right in the mix. It's not a problem because you do need a certain level of staying. Like I was doing an album with Faith Hill, and it was a Christmas record, but we had a big band, we had a big thing going, and it was at Ocean Way Nashville Studio A, and so we cut a bunch of tracks, and then we were overdubbing everything, and then he had 2 tracks she'd cut previously that we were going to overdub all this stuff onto. So we put those tracks on, and we start playing, and the orchestra's playing, and it sounds good, but then all of a sudden it gets to the chorus, and Faith says, well, why does it sound underwater? And we ended up having to, because the person who recorded those tracks compressed all the tracks while it was recorded, all the drums, everything was compressed, and it was unfixable. And so she said, I want the dynamics. And so we had to re-record both those tracks.
Wow.
Because it was just...
And you can't undo it at that point.
You can't undo it.
Yeah.
But you can always, even in Pro Tools, we have unlimited channels. We can always create any sound we want and have that in there. Even if it's on the instrument, but you can always take it off. If when we get to the mix, it's not popping or it's not giving me the attack that I want, I can either take that off or reduce the compression significantly.
Right.
So that you get the best result.
Yeah. Well, it's just a little different way of thinking about it when we talk about using quality gear and how you approach doing these things and what you need to hear. Then, it's a little different way of thinking about it than just getting this down and making it sound good in earbuds.
Right.
Kind of thing. And, I'm a big proponent of passionate about music. I want it to sound as fantastic as it could possibly sound in every situation. Well,
I mean, I've done some mixes with bus compressors and I regret that tremendously. Because some of them, it wasn't like they sounded awful or anything. They were good mixes and everything else, but relative to my stuff that has no compression. And my dear friend Chris Alge, who we did all of his monitor systems, and he has an interesting compression stuff he uses. And he's probably as good as anybody I've seen. But Chris and I, once I put the speakers in and we're listening to this, he's playing some of his earlier stuff that had very little or no compression. He goes, whoa. That's impressive. But Chris, he finesses it pretty great. And what he comes up with is very reasonable and solid.
Absolutely.
But even Chris says the amount of work it would take me not to do it this way, it's a lot more work.
Mm-hmm.
It does.
Yeah.
And he has a formula that works great. And, I don't fault him for that.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure. And it's a little different if you're working on your own stuff, you're in
Right.
a home studio, because you can take whatever time you need to make things work, and you should.
Well, yeah. Well, also, like Chris, he does try to make sure that it's not killing the punch. You want
Right.
some level of impact in punch and everything else.
Yes.
Some people just go, over. It goes over to the other side.
Right.
It goes over to the other side.
Well, he's definitely got it figured out. And I've heard the monitor system in his room, and it sounds absolutely fantastic in there.
It's kind of fun, yeah.
Yeah, it really is. We were out there and saw the Atmos installation with the custom speakers that you did for him, and man, incredible stuff.
Oh, it sounds great.
Incredible stuff, yeah. Man, thank you so much for sitting down.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
So much wisdom, and love hearing the stories and your perspective on all this stuff. And it's all about just getting fantastic audio quality so you can really hear and enjoy the music. That's really the goal.
I agree.
Whatever you use to do that, perfect.
Yeah. The end result, in the end, it's the end result.
That's it.
Some people get so caught up in the process. The process isn't important as the end result.
Right.
Right.
I love it. Great to see you.
A pleasure.
Come back soon.
Okay.
Love to have you.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us here in Studio A at Sweetwater. I'm Mitch Gallagher.